The snow wasn't just falling. It was a judgment. Silent, steady, and relentless, burying the train platform in Applegate Hollow under a blanket of pure, cold dread. Clara Bennett sat on a splintered bench, feeling the ice seep through the soles of her worn-out shoes. Her coat was a joke, a thin piece of Pennsylvania autumn against a Blue Ridge winter that had teeth. But it wasn't the cold that made her tremble. It was the words. 7 words on a flimsy piece of paper. Change my mind. Do not come. Sorry. The telegram felt like a shard of glass in her gloved hand. The train that brought her here was already a ghost, its smoke dissolving into the gray sky. She was stranded, a mail-order bride with no groom. A package returned to sender, only there was nowhere to send her. 3 months of letters, of whispered hopes in a lonely boarding house, of believing a man named Russell Tate needed her. All of it had been a lie. She could feel the eyes of the town on her. The whispers were like wasps in the frozen air. They knew. In a town this small, news didn't just travel fast, it teleported. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. Her father's debts had cost her a teaching position in Philadelphia, had made her a pariah. Russell Tate's letters had been her only escape. Now the escape route had vanished, leaving her in a fresh hell. Her stomach twisted with a hunger that was part starvation, part humiliation. She thought about just walking into the woods, letting the snow cover her tracks, letting her just disappear. Anything would be better than this public shaming. That's when she heard the voice. "Ma'am, that train's been gone near an hour." She spun around. He was tall, built of wool and worn leather with snow clinging to the brim of his hat. His eyes were a startling green, and they weren't filled with pity. They were filled with something far more dangerous. Recognition. "I'm aware," she said, her voice tight. He nodded slowly, taking a careful step closer. "Nathaniel Cartwright," he said. "Nate, if you please. I run a ranch up in the hollow." Clara sized him up. He looked like a man who knew the cost of things, a man who didn't waste words. He looked like trouble, but a different kind of trouble than the one she was already in. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Cartwright. I'm not offering any," he said, his gaze flicking to her single carpet bag. "I am, however, looking for a teacher." Clara froze. A teacher? Out here? 8 children, he went on, his voice a low rumble. Some mine, some belonging to my hands. They need schooling, real learning. And you look like someone with more spine than sense, which is exactly what I need. The world tilted on its axis. How could he possibly know? "How do you know who I am?" "Russell Tate is my neighbor," Nate said, a flicker of disgust in his eyes. "He's got a loud mouth when he's sober, and an even louder one when he's not. He bragged for weeks about the smart, educated woman coming to save him from his sorry self." The shame hit her again, a fresh wave of heat in the cold. "What he did was wrong, Miss Bennett, but it doesn't have to be the end of your story." She stared at him, suspicion warring with desperation. "And you just happened to need a teacher on this exact day?" He shrugged, a motion that seemed to contain a world of mountain luck and hard-won wisdom. "It's real work, $20 a month, room and board included, a warm classroom and a clean slate. Your choice." He wasn't begging. He was offering a lifeline, and they both knew it. She thought of her last few dollars. She thought of the whispers and the stares. What other choice did she have? "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The children," he said, his green eyes serious. "They're not city kids. They're wild things. You'll have to earn their respect, and they can smell fear a mile away." She looked into his eyes and saw something haunted there, something broken, but nothing cruel. He was offering a chance, nothing more, nothing less. She took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs. "Where's the wagon?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Right this way. Try to keep up." As she followed his broad back through the deepening snow, a tiny flicker of warmth ignited in her chest. It wasn't hope. It was something harder, something sharper. It was survival. The platform and the shame faded behind her. Ahead lay Cartwright Hollow, and a future that was a complete and terrifying unknown. The sleigh cut through a world of white and gray. The silence of the mountains was absolute, a heavy quiet that made Clara Ara feel like she was the only person left on Earth. Nate hadn't said much, just handed her a thick wool blanket that smelled of horse and pine smoke. The farther they went, the more the town of Applegate vanished, swallowed by the trees. They were heading into a different world, a place with its own rules. After what felt like an eternity, they crested a ridge, and the valley opened up below them. Cartwright Hollow. It was a cluster of sturdy cabins and barns, smoke rising from the chimneys like prayer flags. It was a working ranch, a place of order and purpose carved out of the wilderness. "Main house is there," Nate said, pointing to a large two-story log structure. "You'll be in the east wing. Schoolhouse is out back." He pulled the sleigh to a halt in the yard. A woman was waiting on the porch. She was tall and severe, with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face into a permanent frown. "Missy Vaughn, this is Miss Clara Ara Bennett," Nate called out. "Our new teacher." The woman's eyes raked over Clara Ara, a quick, dismissive inventory. "So this is the stray you picked up?" Clara Ara flinched, but Nate's voice was calm and steady. "She's our teacher, Missy. Show her to her room." Mrs. Vaughn sniffed, turned without a word, and led the way into the house. The room was small and spare, with a single bed and a washstand. It was a cell, but after the train platform, it felt like a palace. "Breakfast is at 6, Mrs. Vaughn said from the doorway. "Don't be late." Then she was gone. The next morning, Clara Ara walked into the one-room schoolhouse and found 8 pairs of eyes watching her every move. There was a freckled boy named Tommy who looked like he'd rather be wrestling a bear, twin girls who whispered in German, a shy boy named Maria, and a little girl with eyes like bruised violets who just stared. She didn't say a word. She didn't even blink. "That's Annie," Nate had told her. "Lost her folks last year in the fever. Hasn't spoken a word since." Clara Ara introduced herself. She told them she was there to teach them reading and writing. She didn't mention the telegram or the humiliation. She was starting over. This was day 1. Tommy crossed his arms. "We don't need book learning. We need to know how to rope and ride." Clara Ara met his glare. "Reading helps you know if you're getting a fair price for your cattle. Writing helps you order supplies without getting cheated. These are real skills, Tommy. The most real skills you'll ever learn." He didn't have an answer for that. The day was a battle. Maria only spoke Spanish. The twins giggled. Tommy tested every rule, and Annie just sat there, sketching horses with impossible detail on her slate, her silence a wall Clara Ara couldn't seem to breach. By the end of the day, Clara Ara was exhausted, but unbroken. She stepped outside for a breath of cold air and found Nate leaning against the fence. "Still standing?" he asked. "They're a handful," she admitted, "but they're smart. And Annie, she draws like an angel." "She's a good kid," he said, his gaze distant. "Just lost." He looked at Clara Ara, a strange expression on his face. "You did good today. Even Mrs. Vaughn didn't scowl when your name was mentioned at dinner." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara Ara smiled a real smile. She was a teacher again. She had a purpose. But as she looked at the silent little girl staring out the schoolhouse window, a chill went down her spine. It wasn't just grief that was keeping that child silent. It was something else. It was fear. And Clara Ara had a terrible feeling that whatever Annie was afraid of was still out there, lurking somewhere in the shadows of these mountains. The first week at Cartwright Hollow was a blur of chalk dust, whispered German, and Tommy's constant challenges. But slowly, something was shifting. The children were starting to trust her. Even Tommy, who fought her on every lesson, was the first one to finish his arithmetic, a smug look on his face. And Annie, the silent girl, had started leaving her intricate horse drawings on Clara Ara's desk at the end of each day. They were small victories, but they were everything. On Friday, after a grueling spelling lesson, Clara Ara was reading a story to the class when a sharp knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Vaughn, her face a thundercloud. "Mr. Cartwright needs to see you. In the main house. Now." The urgency in her voice sent a spike of alarm through Clara Ara. "Tommy, you're in charge," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "No trouble." She found Nate pacing in the sitting room, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He looked like a caged animal. "You have a visitor," he said, his jaw tight. "A visitor?" Russell Tate. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. The man who had humiliated her, discarded her like trash, was here, in this house. "I told him he had 5 minutes," Nate said, his voice a low growl. "He's lucky he's still breathing." Clara Ara took a deep breath, straightening her spine. "I can handle this." Russell stood by the fireplace, twisting his hat in his hands. He looked smaller, weaker than she remembered. "Clara Ara," he started. "You look... well..." She cut him off. "Why are you here, Russell?" "I came to apologize," he stammered. "I was a coward. I got scared. I didn't expect someone with so much spirit. I thought you'd be more manageable." He was actually admitting he wanted a servant, not a wife. "I want to make it right. Maybe we could start again." Before she could even respond, Nate stepped out of the shadows of the doorway. "That's enough, Tate. Get out." "I think Mr. Tate was just leaving," Clara Ara said, her voice like ice. Russell's eyes darted between them, a flicker of resentment in their depths. He knew he'd lost. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You're making a mistake," he snarled, his gaze fixed on Nate. "Hitching your wagon to him." Then he was gone. Nate closed the door, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "I shouldn't have let him in," he said. "No," Clara Ara said, a strange sense of clarity washing over her. "I'm glad you did. I needed to see him like that. To know I'm not that woman on the train platform anymore." Nate nodded, but his expression was troubled. "He might have started something, Clara Ara. He knows things about me, about my past." A cold knot formed in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "Nate Cartwright isn't my real name," he said, the confession hanging in the air between them. "And there's someone else from my past who knows it. A woman named Evelyn Mercer. She's in Asheville." "The woman you were engaged to?" Clara Ara whispered, remembering a snippet of gossip she'd overheard in town. He nodded, his face a mask of pain. "Before everything fell apart. Before Thomas Hartwell died." He finally looked at her, and the story came tumbling out. He was from a wealthy Boston family. Thomas Hartwell was his father's business partner. He'd found out Hartwell and Evelyn were conspiring to steal the family fortune. "I confronted him," Nate said, his voice hoarse. "We argued. There was a struggle. He fell, hit his head. 3 days later, he was dead. Evelyn told the papers I pushed him. She crucified me. My own family turned their backs on me. So I ran. I disappeared. I came here and became Nate Cartwright." Clara Ara's mind was reeling. A fugitive. She had thrown her lot in with a man wanted for murder. Are they still looking for you?" He shook his head. "The charges were dropped. Lack of evidence. But my name, my real name, is poison back east. I built all this from nothing. And now Russell Tate is here, and Evelyn knows where I am. They can destroy everything." She stepped closer, her heart aching for the man who had shown her such kindness. Then we protect it. Together. Nate looked at her, raw surprise in his eyes. You believe me? Just like that? I believe, she said firmly, that a man who builds a home for lost children and gives a stranger a second chance is not a murderer. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. A bell rang from the schoolhouse, a sharp, clear sound cutting through the tension. I should go, she said. Tommy is probably trying to burn the place down. As she walked back through the snow, the truth walked beside her. It was heavy, and it was dangerous. Nate Cartwright had saved her from one life, but he had just dragged her into the middle of his own personal war. And Clara Ara had a sinking feeling that the first battle was about to begin. The mountains, she was learning, never kept their secrets for long. The peace didn't last. A few days later, a rider came tearing into the hollow, his horse lathered in sweat. It was Lydia Walsh's son from the general store. He had a message. A black coach had arrived in Applegate, a woman from Boston asking for Nathaniel Cartwright. Evelyn Mercer was here. Clara Ara felt the blood drain from her face. Nate, who was mending a harness nearby, went still. They didn't have to wait long. The crunch of wheels on the frozen drive announced her arrival. The coach was sleek and black, pulled by two perfectly matched horses. It was a piece of another world, a world of money and power, and it had come to invade theirs. The door opened, and Evelyn Mercer stepped out. She was everything Clara Ara was not. Dressed in a magnificent fur-trimmed coat, her blonde hair coiled perfectly, she radiated an aura of effortless command. She didn't walk. She glided. Nathaniel, she said, her voice like honey laced with poison. She ignored Clara Ara completely. Evelyn, Nate said, his voice flat. What are you doing here? I came to set things right, she said, producing a leather folio. I went to the authorities. I recanted my testimony. It's all in here. The charges have been formally expunged. Your name is cleared. Nate didn't move. Why now? After all these years? Guilt is a heavy burden, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. But her eyes told a different story. They were cold, calculating. This wasn't about guilt. This was a power play. You didn't come all this way for that, Clara Ara said, finding her voice. Evelyn finally turned her gaze on Clara Ara, looking her up and down as if she were something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. And you must be the charity case. The little schoolteacher he rescued. I'm the one who was here when he needed someone, Clara Ara shot back, while you were leaving him to rot. Evelyn's perfect smile tightened. You have no idea what you're talking about. She turned back to Nate, her tone softening, becoming seductive. Nathaniel, this place, it's beneath you. Come home. We can have it all back. Everything we were supposed to have. I have everything I want right here, Nate said, his voice ringing with conviction. Evelyn's composure finally cracked. For a split second, a look of pure fury crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by a chilly smile. I see. You've chosen this rustic little life. She held out the folder. Take it anyway. You're a free man. He didn't take it. I've been a free man since the day I arrived in this valley. Very well, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. But you should know, Nathaniel, I don't like to lose. She climbed back into her coach, a queen retreating from a battle she had no intention of surrendering. As the coach rolled away, a new, more terrifying thought struck Clara Ara. Evelyn hadn't come to get Nate back. She knew she couldn't. She had come to deliver a message. She had cleared his name only to prove that she still held power over him. She had given him his freedom, which meant she could also take it away. She'll be back, Clara Ara whispered. I know, Nate said, putting a hand on her shoulder. The truth was out, but it hadn't set him free. It had just put a target on his back, and Evelyn Mercer was an expert shot. The next morning, The fragile piece of Cartwright Hollow was shattered. Russell Tate stormed into the schoolhouse, his face flushed with whiskey and rage. "Just came to check on my niece," he sneered, his eyes landing on Annie, who froze in her seat. "She is not your niece," Clara Ara said, stepping between them. She knew from town gossip that Annie's mother had been Tate's sister, and he'd been named her guardian before Nate stepped in. "The law says different," he slurred. "I'm her only family." "You forfeited that right when you left her hungry and bruised," Clara Ara said, her voice shaking with fury. He took a menacing step closer, and for a second she thought he was going to strike her. Just then, Nate appeared in the doorway, his face like thunder. Tate backed down, but not before giving Clara Ara a look of pure hatred. "This ain't over," he spat, and stormed out. Later that day, the second blow fell. Nate came to find her, his face grim. "Evelyn made her move," he said. "She's petitioned a judge. She's claiming I bought this land with money stolen from her family's business. She's trying to take the ranch." Clara Ara stared at him in horror. "Can she do that? She can tie us up in court for years, bleed us dry. She's not trying to win the ranch, Clara Ara. She's trying to burn it to the ground." The war had begun. Evelyn was attacking his home, and Russell was threatening his family. They were being squeezed in a vice. That night, a rider came from town, a deputy marshal. "I have an official request from Boston," he announced grimly, "to reopen the investigation into the death of Thomas Hartwell. New information has come to light." Clara Ara's heart stopped. "What new information?" "Evelyn Mercer has filed a sworn statement," the marshal said, his eyes cold and unsympathetic. "She claims Mr. Cartwright threatened her during her recent visit. She says she now believes he is a violent man, capable of murder, and her original testimony was given under duress." It was a lie. A vicious, calculated lie. But it was a sworn statement from a wealthy Boston socialite against the word of a man living under an assumed name. Clara Ara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, whose story they would believe. Nate was no longer a man with a troubled past. He was a murder suspect all over again. Evelyn hadn't come to reclaim him or his ranch. She had come to bury him, and this time she was digging the grave deep enough for all of them. The world shrank to the size of the sheriff's small, dusty office in Applegate. Nate was taken for questioning, his face a stoic mask that didn't fool Clara Ara for a second. She saw the despair in his eyes. He had run from his past for years, and now it had caught him and wrapped him in chains. But she refused to let it win. She left the sheriff's office and marched straight to the general store, her mind racing. The community. The people Nate had taken in, had given work to, had saved. They were his only hope. She found Lydia Walsh, Carlos Sanchez, and a half-dozen other ranchers and hands gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their faces grim. The news had already spread. "It's a lie," Clara Ara said, her voice clear and strong. "Evelyn is trying to frame him. We have to fight back." "How?" Carlos asked, his brow furrowed. "It's her word against his." "Then we find another word," Clara Ara declared. "The word of the man who hates Nate just as much as she does. Russell Tate." A murmur went through the small crowd. They all knew Tate was a drunk and a coward, but a conspirator? "Evelyn and Russell," Clara Ara explained, the pieces clicking into place in her mind. "They're working together. He's her eyes and ears here. He's the one feeding her the lies to use against Nate." It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. They needed to prove a connection between the wealthy woman from Boston and the town drunk. They split up, a small army fighting for their home. Lydia sent a telegram to the hotel in Asheville where Evelyn was staying, asking the clerk if she'd had any visitors. Carlos and another ranch hand rode out to Tate's miserable little shack on the edge of town to see what they could find. Clara Ara, meanwhile, went back to the ranch house. She began to tear through Nate's old ledgers and papers, searching for anything, any small detail Evelyn could have twisted into a weapon. She worked for hours, her eyes burning, until Mrs. Vaughn quietly entered the room with a cup of tea. The housekeeper, who had always been so cold and distant, looked at Clara Ara with something new in her eyes. Respect. "She won't win," Mrs. Vaughn said, her voice surprisingly fierce. "This is a good place. He is a good man." Just then, Carlos burst in, his face pale. "He's gone. Tate's shack is empty. Cleared out. But we found this in the fire pit, not quite burned." He held up a scorched piece of paper. It was a telegram. Only a few words were legible. "Payment upon. Job is done. Mercer." It was the proof they needed. A direct link. At the same time, a reply came from the hotel in Asheville. The clerk confirmed that a man matching Russell's description had met with Miss Mercer in the hotel bar the night she arrived. They had argued, loudly. They had him. They had the conspiracy. Hope surged through Clara Ara for the first time in days. They raced back to town, the evidence clutched in her hand. They would free Nate. They would save the ranch. They would win. But when they burst into the sheriff's office, they were met not with relief, but with chaos. The sheriff, a man named Madden, looked up at them, his face ashen. "You're too late," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What do you mean?" Clara Ara demanded. "We just got another telegram," the sheriff said, his hand trembling as he held it out. "From the authorities in Asheville. Evelyn Mercer was found dead in her hotel room this morning." The air left Clara Ara's lungs. "Dead?" "That's not all," the sheriff continued, his eyes filled with a terrible certainty as he looked past Clara Ara, toward the jail cell where Nate was being held. "They found a letter beside the body, a suicide note. In it, she confessed that Nathaniel Cartwright had been blackmailing her for years. She wrote that he threatened to kill her if she exposed the truth about Thomas Hartwell's death. She said she couldn't live with the fear anymore. It was the perfect trap. Evelyn had played her final card, and she had played it from beyond the grave. With her dying breath, she had not just accused Nate of being a killer, she had made him her own murderer. Nate wasn't a suspect anymore. He was the only suspect. The frame was complete. The world went silent. The triumphant proof in Clara Ara's hand turned to ash. Russell Tate's conspiracy didn't matter now. Evelyn's letter, her final venomous lie, was all that anyone would see. She had given her life just to take his. Clara Ara looked toward the jail cell, her heart shattering into a million pieces. Nate's face was a stone. He knew, just as she knew, that this was the end. Evelyn had won. She had finally, completely buried him. But as she stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of their lives, a single defiant thought sparked in the darkness of her mind. A dead woman tells no tales. But a dead woman can't defend her lies either. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Clara Ara didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She worked. With Lydia and Carlos by her side, she turned the main house at the ranch into a war room. The sheriff in Applegate was convinced of Nate's guilt, but the authorities in Asheville were more methodical. The investigation would take time they could use. "The letter is a fake," Clara Ara said, pacing the floorboards. "Evelyn was many things, but she was not suicidal. She was a fighter. Someone else wrote that letter, someone who wanted Nate gone and Evelyn out of the way." "Russell Tate," Carlos said, slamming his fist on the table. "He killed her, planted the letter, and ran." "But how do we prove it?" Lydia asked, her face etched with worry. "He's vanished. We find something he left behind," Clara Ara insisted. "Something that ties him to that hotel room." Their only hope was to find a flaw in the perfect frame. They sent another telegram to the hotel clerk in Asheville, begging him to search the room again, to look for anything out of place, anything the police might have missed. A button, a stray hair, a cigar butt. Anything. Days turned into a week. Nate sat in his cell, refusing to see anyone but her. He was hollowed out, defeated. "It's over, Clara Ara," he told her through the bars, his voice devoid of hope. She won. "No," she said, her voice fierce, grabbing the cold iron bars. "She only wins if we give up. I will not give up on you." The breakthrough came from the most unexpected place. Annie. The silent little girl had been watching the chaos with her wide, haunted eyes. One afternoon, she tugged on Clara Ara's sleeve and held up one of her drawings. It was a picture of a man with a cruel face, holding a bottle. Underneath it, she had written a single, shaky word, "Uncle," and then she pointed to her own throat and shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. Clara Ara knelt down, her heart pounding. "Did he hurt you, Annie? Is that why you don't speak? Did he tell you not to?" The little girl nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. Russell Tate hadn't just been a neglectful guardian. He had been abusive. He had silenced her with fear. And then Annie drew another picture, a man giving a woman a letter. The man looked just like her uncle. The woman had blonde hair. At that exact moment, the reply from the Asheville hotel arrived. The clerk, taking pity on their desperate pleas, had done one last sweep of the room before it was cleaned. Tucked deep under the rug, he'd found something, a small silver cufflink monogrammed with the letters RT. They had it. The proof. Russell Tate was in that room. He was the killer. Clara Ara and Carlos rode to the sheriff's office like the devil was on their heels. They laid out the evidence, the cufflink, the burned telegram, and most powerfully, Annie's drawings. The sheriff's face paled as he looked at the child's silent testimony. It was no longer just the word of a suspected murderer against a dead socialite. It was the word of a proven conspirator and child abuser. A federal warrant was issued for the arrest of Russell Tate on charges of murder and conspiracy. The case against Nate collapsed like a house of cards. Hours later, the cell door creaked open, and Nate walked out, a free man. He stumbled into the sunlight, blinking, and saw Clara Ara waiting for him. They didn't speak. They just came together, holding on as if they were the only two people left in the world. The storm had passed. The valley was quiet again. But it was a different quiet. It was the quiet of healing. A few weeks later, as the first signs of spring began to thaw the frozen ground, the whole of Cartwright Hollow gathered in the barn. Lanterns cast a warm, golden glow on the smiling faces of their friends. There was no fancy dress, no priest, just the community that had become their family. Nate stood before her, his eyes clear and full of a love that humbled her. In his hand, he held a small, simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been carrying it for years, waiting for someone worth giving it to." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Clara Ara Bennett, you fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. You saw the man I was, not the ghost I was running from. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me?" Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." As the fiddle music started up and the celebration began, Clara Ara looked around at the faces in the crowd. Lydia, Carlos, Mrs. Vaughn, and all the children. And there, standing by the door, was Annie. She was holding hands with Maria, and for the first time since Clara Ara had met her, she was smiling. As Clara Ara watched, Annie leaned over and whispered something in Maria's ear, and they both giggled. The silence was broken. The fear was gone. Later that night, Clara Ara and Nate sat on the porch of the main house, wrapped in a blanket under a sky full of stars. The sounds of laughter and music drifted from the barn. She leaned her head on his shoulder. It had all started on a train platform, with 7 words that felt like an ending. But it wasn't an ending. It was a detour. It was the first step on a long, hard road that had led her here. Home. She had come to the mountains looking for a husband, but she had found so much more. She had found a family, She had found her strength. She had found herself. What do you think? Did Clara Ara make the right choice trusting Nate? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.